Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Dan Winter, fractalfield.com, fractalu.com, and you probably recognize who I'm with here, the very famous, very wonderful Tony Rodriguez. Thank you for
Thanks,
joining us.
thanks, Dan. That was a great intro. I'll take it. Maybe it's a little over the top, but I'll take it. So happy to be here. I love our talks.
You know that Tony is, in my view, one of the most articulate and in-depth experiencers, the SSP, Secret Space Program Experiences. His book, Ceres Colony Cavaliers. See, I remember I liked that book. And in the depth of Tony's memory of his time working as kind of an engineer in many roles with the basically the Nazi Dark Fleet. Is that right, essentially?
Yeah, everybody, the term Nazi gets thrown around, and I think that they identified as Deutsch, dark, and zero hour or midnight fleet. So dark fleet is kind of a term that's being debated these days. I remember them calling it 0 hour, meaning midnight, meaning that they attained when they attained time travel.
Yes,
that meant that every time where they go, it's 0 hour.
Aha, good to know. And so, as some of you know, that apparently the Nazis, or the German at that time, they had used the Mercury vortex they had learned from studying Vimana, being Hanibu, in Nazi. And they basically put the Mercury vortex in submarines. That's how they first did it, if I understood correctly.
Yes. So, and there were radioactive components. So
Yes.
I was understood that they had radioactive water, steam, that had been exposed, that were components going through some of the larger pipes of the ship. So if that was part of the power generation or the locomotion, I don't know. But we were just doing maintenance on the bottom of the ship. I did that for quite a long time.
This is what's very important to realize here. Here's a man, Tony, who actually was working in engineering on these ships for many years with these alternative propulsion systems. Have we learned something, question mark, about the physics? And Tony and I began this brainstorm a bit back. We said, oh, well, this might be a shareable wave. Maybe there's some pure principle here somewhere.
And then from my perspective, I was just a low-level employee. So from your perspective, the theoretical science and the science behind everything. So if they marry up, then that means that
is the question.
It's a form of evidence and possibly breadcrumbs in the right direction.
That's right. Does your experience fit our understanding of physics? This is the question on the table at the moment. And I'm interested also that you mentioned when they accomplished time travel. Remember when we defined time as simply charge rotation, and that rotation rate changes when you accelerate. So when they say, you're warping space-time, that's a crappy language. Actually, what's happening simply is if you accelerate a torus, which is mass, some of the acceleration inertia is translated in vorticity affecting spin rate, named time. So this is not a mystery. And in conventional physics, in phase conjugate optics, for example, when they say they did time reversal, what they essentially mean is they moved a system backwards in time only in the sense that they moved it to return to order, defined as negentropy. So in conventional physics, you can't time reverse toward disorder. They haven't measured that yet. No, they've measured time reversal toward order. Hello. So, but the other, I guess you could say, rumor we heard here, and this may have been in part courtesy of Elena, was that when the Nazis achieved time travel, they went backwards in time and gathered a lot of resources, accelerating their rate of technological evolution, which is how, for example, part of how they conquered Ceres and later became interstellar rather quickly. That's what we were told. Does that fit what you?
So there is. So I was under the impression, because the question came up. So we were working on missions that we called it anti-telephoning. So that's a term, it's a scientific term that I found out later, but I remember they called anti-telephoning the missions, to where they could schedule very aggressive missions, in real time. So basically leaving today at 7 a.m., we'd get in the ship and fly away, and they could go to another star system, and they could schedule a very aggressive mission, because the ship would come back into a predetermined coordinate away from the planetoid that they could see 5 minutes before it left. So it was a loophole in the law. So there are time travel laws throughout the cosmos
Yes.
between societies that have the ability to time travel. So
Mhm.
there was a policing that went on. So what they determined, the loophole, because they got in trouble for it, they said, it was my understanding that in the early years they were very aggressive about it, and when they finally got caught, that the punishment was extremely steep. In other words, the director, or whoever was in charge of ordering people to go back in time and gather resources, like you said, like I don't know the specifics on that, but whoever was in charge would get taken and have to live out a horrible life for 1,000 years and then return to the same moment he was taken from. And so that was all the discouragement they needed. And they said, if you do it again, then it'll be all of you will get this. You'll get 1,000 years of misery, and then we'll put you right back to this moment. So that was the story that I was told. Whether that's factual, I mean, it's up for debate, but like I said, I only had my perspective, my memories of what I saw, and we always ask the question, why don't you just go back in time and fix it? I just want to dovetail, finish that off what I was saying about the anti-telephony, because it was very important, and it's a very powerful thing. If you think about the ability for
Oh,
a
yeah.
spaceship. So I use my pen. So it left Ceres and flew to another star system at 7 a.m. And then it didn't appear back at Ceres at 6:55 a.m. It appeared 5 minutes away at maximum speed as the crow flies. So it didn't actually travel time, because it still had to finish the journey, and it would be back exactly at 8 or 7 a.m., the same time that it left. But the people inside Ceres could see the ship. So if it came back, only the captain knew the coordinates that it would return to. So if the ship were taken over by a hostile force, could appear at the wrong coordinates, and they could cancel the mission on this end, and there would be an instant paradox. They said that, I didn't see it personally, but it did happen on several occasions where the ship was sent out and it did come back to the wrong coordinates, and so they just scrubbed the mission. So the ship never leaves, and the other ship would disappear immediately. That was the effect. They said that there was no kind of like magical special effect. The ship would immediately just disappear. And so that was the anti-telephoning technique. Whenever that did happen, the authorities would ask everybody on the ship for the next few days, for the coming week, if you had any dreams about a mission that never happened, we want to hear about it. They were taking reports on what we were dreaming.
Yeah.
It was
Interesting.
very important to them.
That's beautiful, because the physics here, we now know the physics of lucid dreaming, which is propagating in longitudinal interferometry, which is what I call it, which is the compression nodes of the array, which support teleportation, remote viewing. It's all about how a longitudinal wave can manipulate heat at a distance, because in the stability of the array determines where you can show up in the array. So these calculations of the coordinates, for example, the physics would suggest that the send and receive point are far more functional if there are natural places of charge compression in the longitudinal array. For example, we've been assured by others that when the ETs set up a Stargate or portal, even on Earth, they normally do it at a place where there's a natural magnetic cross-point compression line, a portal, a natural portal, because it's far more efficient. And this is also then true of the send receive point of your remote viewing team, by the way.
The remote viewing has come a long way. It
Yeah.
started out, I'd researched my experiences in the early days of the very first part of my 20 years when I was taken. I was on Earth, and I was in a program that was used for a form of remote viewing, like a kind of a different form, but for security, in drug running. So when I researched that, I was just trying to prove my account. Proof is everything for somebody that has, testimony like mine. So you have to prove it. I have to defend myself. I would never go on stage. I would never go in front of people with all these claims if I didn't have something to back it up, because it's just, you take hits. I take my hits. When I started researching it, I thought, I found a great deal of evidence. I found a great deal of things. Also, there were details that I remembered that were not in the evidence. So I started a group, and we began practicing it, and we were doing things like giving ourselves good luck or healing. Everybody, basically, if you can do a group that heals people, that goes into a synchronized meditation, you get 20 people, and they all do a synchronized meditation with a certain combination of techniques that I learned, thank courtesy of the CIA. You get a great deal of results from it. So healing was the big one. But as a practice mode, to practice going into that state of mind, we began to remote view.
Yes.
And we did it very novel, in a very novel way, like, hey, let's just take a look. We weren't really serious about it. And lo and behold, we started getting incredible results. Some people were better than others.
Yes.
And
not to interrupt it, please finish. I was just going to say that what we have to benefit by saying what we now understand about the physics of how these things work could greatly empower those people trying to do these things. A couple of reminders here that after we determine that the longitudinal EMF coherence, sometimes called scalar, we developed with plasma tubes and a phase conjugate array called Therify.net, doing rejuvenation, quote, time reversal, successfully commercially in 25 countries, we then learned people are regularly triggering lucid dreams directly, which basically means compress the body implosively, and the body begins to emit more of its charge inertia with longitudinal compressional coherence instead of the less efficiently propagating transverse EMF component. Remember, the transverse electromagnetic wave is that which goes perpendicular to the direction of propagation, all of our radio communication. However, the longitudinal component or compressional component, sometimes called scalar or torsional, goes parallel to the direction of propagation. And when that bounces at an array of nodes called fractal, at the points where it bounces, the Earth grid nodes, where telepathy is proven by measurement possible, where nuclear radioactive critical mass is proven to be reduced, and we know why. These are the compression nodes where longitudinal and transverse EMF are exchanging inertia, where you could, for example, contain heat at a distance and solve the holy grail of fusion physics, because you can contain heat at a distance, for example, with longitudinal microwave.
So that representation was like the globe. You're looking at nodes on the globe.
But the shape of DNA, Earth grid, zodiac, and every living protein. And recently, my new equation proved this is precisely, by equation, how hydrogen is built. And the reason hydrogen makes gravity as well, called implosive charge collapse. And my new book on the physics of gravity is out as of today, planckfire.com. Check it out, Planck, Planck. Fire, PHIRE.com.
I have to stop and translate you a little bit. It's funny because you go quickly and I kind of get what you're saying, but every now and then I have to try and translate. I think a simple animation on the implosion, a simple animation would be very helpful to a lot of people.
It's non-destructive charge collapse. So if you take the cube octa and collapse to ecosa, and you provide a trajectory for the charge collapse, which is non-destructive, which is Einstein's definition of the solution of the unified field, non-destructive charge collapse. The trajectory followed by those spirals, cube octa, icosa, octa, and tetra. So that charge collapse path is the physics of superconductivity and gravity.
And this is a electron?
Well, this is called Bucky-Fuller's vector flexor jitterbug, but it is later proven to be the geometry of non-destructive charge collapse. Even Nassim is talking about that, as in, for example, the only real mechanism of superconductivity is non-destructive charge collapse. So the point is that if there's a way out for the charge when it goes through center, compressed through the Planck threshold, that way out is when the charge inertia translates its vorticity in and becomes a longitudinal wave coherently. Actually, maybe just a quick slide, I suppose, here. But so this is a background when we then discuss shortly the gravity wave technology. I'm going to do a share screen 1 second. Let's see if I can do this keynote.
Well, I want to say a little bit, while you're doing that, that the remote viewing is startling.
Yes.
The results we're getting on the remote viewing is absolutely startling. People are very accurate, and it's done where we moved into a completely blind environment. In the beginning, we weren't blind because it wasn't about the remote viewing being accurate. It was about getting into the state of mind.
Exactly.
So there's a focused state of mind that you're after that enables all these things. And so it was just practice. But now we're doing completely blind, just numbers in an envelope, and across the board, people are describing the actual verifiable target. So it's amazing. There's no way. I've heard rumors of debunking remote viewing. It's just not real. It's just, remote viewing is a real thing, and if it's very easy for you to learn the way to do it and to immediately have results.
Yes. And part of that training is teaching the brain to do implosive compression. These are the brainwave harmonics we measured just before Jean-Charles Moyen did bilocation with witnesses. So the brainwave harmonics here on the bottom, the alphas in green, the harmonics that are labeled in pink are golden ratio. I'm sorry, harmonics in pink are octave to the green alpha, and the harmonics in blue are golden ratio. And so basically you're making that star mother tensor array tetracube inside dodecikos. And so your brain is making the compression vectors to implode charge and spit out the longitudinal wave. This is the preceding project when we taught kids to see without their eyes. They made the same harmonics, octave and golden ratio cascades to alpha, but Jean-Charles were radically more coherent just before he bilocated. And so that ability to compress and be distributed in the array is basically based on the brain. Here's 5 golden ratio harmonics in the brain waves. This is me having bliss, versus here is octave harmonics, which is a telepath at work. And these are technologies. Notice the top of the head lights up with that coherence right here. And this is actually where you're squirting the longitudinal coherence right out the top of your head, which is what basically is behind Monroe Institute when they use golden ratio harmonics in binaural beats to literally.
Well, I was going to say that they have you imagine a toric they have you imagine energy going out your feet and good energy coming in.
Well, that's great.
The top, I believe that's the,
yes.
They have you imagine sucking in good and positive energy and stale negative energy going out your feet.
That's good.
Breathing technique.
And so this is a implosive vortex, and the squeeze point at the center is where the transverse EMF is compressed and squeezed out the toothpaste tube into coherent longitudinal propagation. And that was called the Ba from the Ka in Egypt, and Kesjan body by Gurdjieff, and rainbow light body by the Tibetans. But electrical engineers call it longitudinal EMF coherence, and propagating in that array, for example, that's when the children who close their eyes and they have that brainwave state, they're taught the trance, and then they see a vortex appear inside their head. It's literally a tube. They describe it that way repeatedly. And the center of that vortex tornado becomes an eyeball, and they can see through it. And that is a plasma vortex, which is the physics of what you take with you when you lucid dream and when you die. And so there's some predictors here. For example, when you have out-of-body experience or lucid dream, there are some places where that plasma vortex really can't go very good. An aluminum box, for example, is a horrible place.
Or in a heavily saturated EMF field area. So
exactly.
That's the Faraday cage.
Yes. Well, a longitudinal can go through a Faraday cage, but it can't exchange inertia very well there. Actually, when Ingo Swann lit that thermistor with his mind at a distance and was measured repeatedly, that's how our software came to be named flameinmind.com. He was literally making that flame in his mind, and he lit a flame at a distance. And he did it in a Faraday cage. But still, the point is well taken here that once we know that your position in the longitudinal array limits your leverage. Remember Korotkov going all over the planet with Kozyrev, measuring. They only got military quality telepathy every time with those Kozyrev mirrors, which is basically a microwave columnator. They only did it when they placed it at the magnetic Earth grid line cross points, this array. These are the places they could get military telepathy, elsewhere not.
I'm curious. So the first thing that comes to mind is you're establishing pieces of real estate that are more valuable than others.
Absolutely. In the array.
Is it
in the array.
fluid? Yep. Does it move, or are these places that are on the Earth that are still fixed?
Well, remember, Bruce Cathy proved on the same grid, harmonic 33, that there was dramatic reduction in nuclear critical mass at those nodes, which was a top military secret for years, but oh crap. But it's a compression node. And because this is indirectly where the speed of light divides evenly the circumference and that kind of thing, the array has some movement, but it's fairly stable, actually, which is why every single great pyramid, every single great labyrinth and stone circle, they're all on the nodes of that array. They have to be. And by the way, Therify works better there too, and your remote viewing is going to work better there too. but there's something else we should say that predicts many other things that you can optimize by understanding the physics instead of regarding it as a mystery. For example, sunrise and sunset, much better phase conjugate access to the array because the right angles, the indigenous called it the sacred four directions, but in physics it's called four-wave mixing and phase conjugate optics. It's also the physics of how Agnihotra only works at sunrise, sunset. So there's some very definite aspects to this propagating in the array. And when you did these calculations of the send and receive point in the portals, et cetera, these are all taken into account dramatically because these are the places where conjugation enables impedance matching to the longitudinal EMF array, inhabit the array. And this was later called Songline, Dreaming Track, Heaven, Plains of Sharon, and it was also called the collective unconscious in the communion of saints. These are all
help me understand the phenomenon of sunset, though. Is that because there's an effect on the, it's like glancing off the earth, the sunlight?
The physics of the green flash in rainbow physics. We saw one 3 nights in a row in Perth, by the way.
Yeah, I used to live in Hawaii. We saw them all the time.
Oh, yeah, good. Okay. The physics of the green flash, it happens only when the atmosphere is electrically coherent. And by the way, the same coherence determines whether or not rainbows happen. It's well documented. It's historically, scientifically documented. When great Tibetan saints die, there are more rainbows. We're here to describe the physics of that actually, wow, by contributing centripetal charge coherence to their environment. The same reason down that song line of that ancestral family, when Auntie Lorraine died, the storm went across the continent on their family song line, which was a family pet. That's a magnetic line.
This is documented.
Oh yeah, I got the poems, I got presentations. Auntie Lorraine, the Bunjalung. It's well known in Australia. So the magnetic line across the continent becomes a family pet if you walked on it magnetically for 1,000 generations and sang the song correctly. And when you put that shaman in a car going down the song line, suddenly they begin singing the song like a 33 record played on 78. It's really cool.
Faster. Right, because they're moving faster, and they're basically channeling the song from.
It's literally a song line, yeah. So this magnetic array, this is nothing to fool with, man. Understanding these coordinates is how you inhabit the array, and that's everything. That is the only path to actual immortality. It's the only path through death. That's why dying in electrosmog hospitals is death.
That was something that stuck with me the last time we talked. You mentioned that dying in a hospital with all the smog, the muck. Electric muck is
not good.
Guess detrimental. Detrimental to the.
Well, it's the truest. The same is true for birth, basically. If you had the altar at Machu Picchu, that's good. but basically, you need a place of leverage on the array. So when they think about hospice and places designed for birth and death, they're idiots if they let all the electrosmog crap in there. Because that disturbs, in all these pictures I have in the slideshow, but I won't dig them out now, where you see the soul leaving the body and the body's floating up, and their photographs. Every one of those photographs happened in the woods, and not one of them happened in a hospital. Hello.
The ancient Hawaiians. So I lived on Maui for 9 years. My family's from there. And while I was there, I was looking at the old, I began to research, pre-Hawaiian, the structure, the ancient Hawaiian and the culture, the Polynesians. And there are two structures, the largest structure in the state of Hawaii is on Maui. It's a heiau, Pi'ilani's heiau, and that is facing the sunrise. And what I found was that's where they had babies born.
Exactly.
And it's oriented to the sunrise. There's another structure that is, I don't know the name of it, but it's down the road and it's facing the sunset and it's on a cliff. And that's where they had sacrifice. They were killing people at that, the criminals that got killed at that heiau, and it was at sunset. So, and I was researching cannibalism, ritual human sacrifice. Why do they do that? And I was shocked when I learned that it was a global phenomenon all the way up until Christianity. So like you said, the muck and the sunset they were choosing, it might not have been so macabre or so dreadful to know that you were mortally wounded or mortally ill and choose the optimum moment of your death, that this may have been going on in these ancient cultures and they had a place for that to happen. So
Yeah.
that's
When we drove up 90 Mile Beach to the north tip of New Zealand, and they said this is where the native people went to die and they could propagate from here, So, the sunrise and sunset have perpendicular vectors, and the green flash is the coherence that's enabled by that phenomena, basically. It's important to know that the reason color exists is phase conjugation. The physics is at fractalfield.com/fractal photosynthesis.
real quick question. So are you more worried about the photonic energy or the magnetic energy that's coming from the sun in that direction, in that instance?
Remember, the phase conjugation is broad spectral, and it's all made of the same stuff. It's called charge, and those are different spectrum. And magnetic phase conjugation is as powerful as optical. Very few people know that, but it's the fact that it's broad spectral. For example, when you put a copper square on the roof and a wire to the basement, and the basement is pitch black, but the longitudinal wave arrives in the basement, the plants will grow just fine in the pitch dark. That's the longitudinal energy of the sun being delivered to your basement.
And I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
I wish I would have known that before I killed so many plants in my house.
And also that's why you need to get the damn moon out of the way if you want a seed to germinate, or a child, actually, because the moon, being hollow and metal, has the wrong dielectric. But
speak of the devil.
Well, no, the Andromeda, the Federation had to stick it in here to stabilize after the Lesser Dryad, and but
yeah,
anyway.
I always say to people, if you think of the moon as a craft that can move things, that can turn on and change its gravitational force, it's an extremely powerful, extremely useful. It's a solar system tractor. So they can move the orbits of things around macro objects. There's a great deal of things. And in my time in the secret space program, we were aware that the moon had one of the greatest sources of power, of artificial power. Like, it put out more power than most of the other colonies that we did. So there were exotic technologies that were only on the moon because of power output. So whatever's powering it, I don't know, but we were all aware that certain technologies couldn't work anywhere else but the moon because of the generator that it had.
We're going to talk about the crystal energy technology here. I actually have a slide about that. But just first, have we finished the conversation about the fact that the longitudinal interferometry is predictive to remote viewing, for example? The other point I wanted to make was that the children who just finished going to that brainwave state, trance bliss, and then they can repeatedly see without their eyes, many of them kind of scare the hell out of their parents because they start seeing their ancestors. Very common, well known in the East. This is taught at the New Zealand School for seeing that. So
interesting. I have a quick question about the bliss. So we had talked before, and I mentioned that, the same way that you can remember a song, the same way that you can recall the lyrics of a song, can you go into the state of bliss the same way? Can you remember a time that you were blissful and create the wave of bliss? Or do you actually have to be in genuine bliss? I mean, do you have to eat a chocolate bar or find whatever it is? Like, do you actually have to generate bliss that way? Or can you just recall the emotion the same way you would a song?
No, that's good. Well, another way that skill was classically taught, when Korotkov first measured kids seeing without their eyes and discovered golden ratio in brainwaves, flameinmind.com, one of the techniques they used was the kids would close their eyes and they would imagine themselves in beautiful nature. And in that moment, it was like flipping a switch. Just the imagination that they were sitting in beautiful nature, their brainwaves would go golden ratio and their body would start imploding.
So that's one of the
Flip the switch
ways to do that. Yeah. So that is, in a way, you're imagining, but that is like playing a recording.
Well, exactly. That's the point. And remember, you see, the baby might be happy the first time you stick the pacifier in its mouth, but the second time it realizes there ain't no milk there.
Right. There's much less bliss.
So the point is, your body is correct to start imploding when it enters beautiful nature, like Luke Skywalker when he became a Jedi, because implosion is the way you project the plasma coherence called the raising of the Jed, actually, and the Jed towers of Egypt similarly. This was called boson 7, microcredience in the blood and all that. So plasma projective, but a particular kind of plasma projective, which is called longitudinal coherence, also how the Star Wars saber worked, actually. So, but your question is, how can you trigger the bliss? Is it more than chocolate bar? I like that question.
Yeah, well, that's a very important, for one, and for two, I'm starting to draw. So when we talk about the remote viewing, so I have a group, the people that participate not only in the remote viewing, but in the manifesting, the synchronized meditation. We synchronize on a target, and lo and behold, we got excellent results. So, we kind of stumbled upon it. Fortunately, I had people watching my show that could digest that kind of information and participate. So it's a much higher, and we meet every week and do this. Going into that, I'm starting to wonder, these are people from all over the world. Like most of the people in America, but there are people from Europe. There are people from the Europeans have a hard time making the late meetings, at the 8 p.m.s is very late in Europe. So we tend to not retain them because it's on Tuesday night. But what I'm starting to think now is that maybe the people that are very proficient in the remote viewing group and in this group live in an area that you're describing.
Well,
So it's different. And it seems like people get hot and cold. So it's not always, some
yes,
people have very accurate remote views, and then the next time they're kind of off. And, we all live hectic lives. So we don't know exactly what's causing it. But the
but
people that are consistently accurate, I'm starting to wonder if they live in an area that they can go into that state of mind much quickly, or if they're just profoundly psychic.
well, so that's the point, that we would like to now make a list of the factors which determine, for example, if you're supposed to make a magnetic map first of your bed, then your house, then your yard, and then your village. And when you're done, you rearrange the magnetic lines in each case to look like a rose, and then you're done. So what that means actually is enabled compression, fractality actually. And so obviously, if your bed is at a magnetic cross point, you have a lot more leverage. Another thing we said about the SSP experiencers, we hypothesized, even in your case, that, we know that about 90% of the abductees after the Greada Treaty were people who had some indigenous blood, and we believe it was because they're more likely to be lucid dreamers, which means they're more likely to be longitudinally coherent, which means they have the DNA that the bad guys don't, which is called boson 7 or microchloridians, which basically is longitudinally coherent implosion in the DNA, which means susceptible to bliss, but also after bliss. For example, you can dowse, because then you feel magnetic lines. I can feel magnetic lines at great distance, actually, myself. I'm not clairvoyant, but I'm clairaudient.
You explained that to me last time we talked, and I haven't tried it yet. I've been on the road, and I'm kind of curious. I'm kind of almost afraid. Most of the time in my life, I'm not afraid of failure. I'm afraid of success, because it
You
changes your
might be
life.
sensitive. Maybe you're
That's right,
sensitive.
because
Oh, that means, a bad dowser moves the water vein back into the well with a hammer and percuss. But a good dowser moves the water vein back into the well by talking to the magnetic line.
so that's an entire subject I've got to research and look into, the dowsing.
Yeah,
It is a real thing.
yeah. So this is to say that the access to that grid, you could make a list of factors. If you had some indigenous blood, more likely your ancestors walked the same magnetic line for 1,000 generations. And so those magnetic lines are more closer to being a family pet, basically. And also, if you are living near magnetic line cross, if you do it the right time of day, the ability to lucid dream is a predictor of many of these things. So you could begin to do a few questionnaires. So effectively, we're saying that longitudinal coherence is a determiner, not just of lucid dreaming and remote viewing, but we're pretty sure that lucid dreaming skill predicts who will have a successful death.
Wow, successful. I think we're all going to succeed at it.
No, actually, success is well defined. It's the ability to take memory through death, which is basically to survive compression, acceleration, to inhabit the array. And it's interesting that we know Swaru, for example, who became basically Borg, did too damn much time travel and scrambled her eggs. And then they tried to reconstitute her memory from the shipboard computer. That's called soullessness. And that's exactly what we're trying to avoid by teaching the mistakes.
So I wonder if this is part of the ancient technology. Retaining your memory through death is something
Exactly.
that the ancients learned and
And
mastered.
and
Absolutely mastered it. And these are the people that are running things now.
Well, but in part of how the plot thickens here, I was so proud when my prediction that Earth would be the vaccine for the Orion Wars. And then Elena says, oh, yeah, the three tall grays they captured after screwing with Eisenhower are the ones they used to poison the Orion Queen. And the Orion Nebu Federation fell apart. So we were the vaccine for the Orion.
It did work that way.
But the point I wanted to make was that those grays, the reason they abducted only basically the lucid dreamers was a clue to what DNA they were trying to steal. And guess what their problem was? Soullessness, effectively, that, the Draco culture, we believe, had recognized, thousands of years ago, that they were losing long-term memory, actually. And that's why I think the Draco was named Charlie, who ran Montauk. I talked to the chief time empath about this, why they abducted only the teenagers who could lucid dream to steer the time chair. Well, steering the time chair at Montauk required that same skill to navigate in a lucid dream, basically, which is superluminal and requires longitudinal coherence.
Interesting. So like when you would have that, like you said, longitudinal coherence, you're actually in touch with the whole universe, the whole
array.
Once you're outside of time space,
well,
you're accessing time and space, all of it at once. So, and then somebody that couldn't, soullessness, would be somebody, and this falls right into the philosophy of the people that are service to self, they feel themselves separated from all of creation, so that there's no problem doing immoral things because they're personally the creation, they're separated from it. And people that have this ability are in contact, so they become service to others.
And yes, perfect, well said. But we believe, for example, this term outside time and space is really not very helpful electrically. But we agree with you completely what you're saying about the physics of compassion. So when we taught, I invented the term heart coherence and how to measure it, heart coherence, realheartcoherence.com. And basically the heart turns inside out recursively. And that implosion, I developed the mathematics to measure and taught Heart Math Institute. And that onset of heart coherence is basically implosion in the EKG. And it's the beginning of the compassion because it's the beginning of the ability to turn inside out electrically or implode, actually. And the reason that defines empathy and is directly related to the physics of ensoulment is because it's at the implosion point, you get that, it's called impedance matching, coupling into the compression nodes of the array. And so when you touch the center of the compression of that array, and you can handle stillness, like Daniel Brinkley inhabiting lightning in 3 near-death experiences, when you can access the still point in that array, suddenly you're coupled to it, which is why the greatest Templar initiation was always 3 days dead. They called it the lost art of resurrection. But basically, it's the ability to go through a still point, and that couples you to the array, and that's called initiation, actually.
So you're calling it not outside of time space, you're calling it the array.
Yes, calling it outside time and space is useless language. It doesn't tell you anything. No.
I think I read that somewhere. I think I read that in a what do you call it? A report based on the Gateway project. Yeah. Well, so they were trying to summarize it. That's why I use
it's like a biologist using the word instinct, because the word instinct is their word for we don't have a clue. Well, actually, saying it's outside of time space just means, well, we really are clueless about this, so we're going to invent some dumb words.
So it's inside time space, but it's the array of time space that you're accessing, the entire array.
Access to the leverage of those compression points, the nodes. So see, at those nodes, there's a cascade of harmonics, and those harmonics are golden ratio multiples times c, the speed of light, somewhat documented by Professor Raymond Chow's dominant measures of all velocities faster than light centered right around golden ratio times the speed of light. Hello, that is proof smoking gun. And so when you do this time travel, the more leverage you get on the nodes of that array, the more ability you can propagate at higher and higher multiples of the speed of light in the array. That's why, the Orion Wars were over the Stargate and the trapezium, because more compression there, that Stargate could go further.
So those nodes, I mean, if I'm understanding this right, because I know that when you go into this state of mind, you have access to, there is time, like distance doesn't matter, so the speed of light isn't really,
it is not a speed limit.
Doesn't apply. It's basically you're accessing the entire array simultaneously.
That's right.
In other words, you push on one end, it can be anywhere on the other. So it's all like a live array. So the
Yeah.
array is connected. It's like one medium.
These are like still points. And when you touch one point here, the point on the other side feels it directly. And that
And all of
feeling,
them.
yeah, that feeling connection between the one point and the other point is limited by how still the compression point is at each node. So visualize each node as the center of a pine cone kissing noses. The bigger the pine cones kissing noses there, and of course the pine cones kissing noses in the heart of Orion, trapezium, square, cube, four-wave mixing. That is a good Stargate, man.
That was a big place. It was
Yeah, we actually, maybe this is an excuse to play the slides here since we have all those slides actually cooked up for this conversation. So let me see if I can do this right. So slide numbers 20 to 52. Just so the idea, this part of the conversation was compare Tony's experience with ... So this is what the Arcturians called planet taming, planting the pyramids at tetrahedral latitudes, and it phase locked the Earth's spin rotation with zodiacal rotation. And so the zodiacal rotation can cascade like a caduceus into the Earth's spin rotation, stabilizing gravity and atmosphere, called planet taming. Effectively, the pyramid in that case is literally a gravity diode. But point here on the bottom, you see the armature in this spinning craft is merely delivering a high voltage to a concave surface, which is the Searle principle, and that delivers a longitudinal component. This, which is a gravity wave. This is top right how phase conjugation works, and this is the trapezium cube in Orion, the big Stargate, and this is the double vortex.
Hold on a second. Could you go back to the previous one? And so the top right, how the cone vortex works. So that's your pine cone. Now,
Well,
are those?
that's how lasers phase conjugate. That's called four-wave mixing. And note the golden ratio optimizes. Yes.
So is this? I'm just curious. Is it coming out or going towards the center? These waves.
Well, actually, the lasers would appear to be converging towards center. What emerges from the compression point is no charge can pass through that center compression point without being sorted into phase. And that's why if you have bliss, you dump your astral parasites, for example. But
like a laser, like putting the photons in a.
Well, this is
order.
pure phase conjugate optics. The lasers have to meet in a very accurate cube. And when they do, they have to meet in a superconducting medium called phase conjugate dielectric barium strontium titanate, which is charge distribution permissive, to enable the pine cones to kiss noses and touch accurately at the Planck threshold, where the conjugation implosive compression occurs. And that's where the sorting happens, called negentropy, the title.
It's funny that a lot of the people in the early CIA CIA research projects, Grill Flame, that morphed into Center Lane, that morphed into Stargate, were all laser guys.
There you go. They had a clue, but not one of them could answer you why they needed a phase conjugate dielectric at the center point, because they didn't know that's. But phase conjugate dielectrics then are also how, Nostradamus made his scrying and how Jean D talked to angels. It's phase conjugate mirror physics, actually. And that's how the Olmec communicated with ancestors in the obsidian mirror. It's literally a phase conjugate. That's why when kids start phase conjugating, they can see their ancestors.
So an obsidian mirror wouldn't let any kind of energy pass through it.
Well, the obsidian mirror is a way of coupling with a longitudinal array, enabling you to see your ancestors. But there still could definitely be some astral hygiene problems there. And more natural way to do this was, the circle of shaman went into trance, and by their intent, they determined that no bad ancestors made phone calls. So there's definitely astral hygiene issues. So this is the lensing of the Orion classical called Antarian conversion. This is the actual geometry.
Wow. Holy moly.
The actual geometry of the star masses around Orion. So you see why. And this was called Yod-He Vav-He because it's actually two light cones, Yahweh. And the Yahweh was just a name for a title of those who can inhabit a big plasma vortex. It doesn't mean that Enlil Yahweh qualified. No, he was a wannabe. But so this is the Antarian conversion. So you can see the Stargate physics fits the metaphor. And we've got all.
And that's an extremely, so for people that may not think about it, that's an extremely huge area of space.
Absolutely big.
So
But
when you're
notice,
talking about waves that are the size of the solar system
yeah, the
are
size,
enabled by that.
a
Like,
big chunk of the size of the galaxy. And so there's a gravitational lensing, and the climax point of gravitational lensing is phase conjugation, which actually is where the centripetal force actually holds the galaxy together. Black holes becoming intelligent. This is what's called Peshme 10, the way of the nine by the Hopi, and later became Deep Space Nine and the return of the nine, the plasma physics, and we have more slides later on that. So anyway, this is the alpha doorway. So this is the change the subject slightly. The Egyptian Djed, you see the Djed tower is plasma projective because the piezo is implosive capacitively. And so that means is, and this then, if you take this in the next, axis of symmetry, this actually is how DNA works to project the Djed, which is, longitudinal coherence. During bliss, your DNA does all the same stuff. So your DNA is spitting out. And the geometry of the Charlie's East, the angle of 76 degrees was
hold it right there. So you're covered a lot of distance here, but on this one, on that other one with this one. So the angle of these, what is the angle on this?
The 76 degree is the peak angle of the it's the base angle of the Egyptian pyramid and the peak angle of the Russian pyramids. In both cases, it's so golden ratio could phase conjugate the implosive capacitance and project a longitudinal, which is what a gravity wave is made of, which is why the pyramid could be a gravity diode. Also, how the pyramid could take the what's called phase conjugate pump wave, golden ratio times Planck, which is the Schumann harmonics, and dump out the longitudinal that became an effective functional global wireless power grid. Tesla had the frequencies and the nodes wrong.
So a lot of crystal breaks on, I believe it's 52 or 51.5 degrees.
Yeah.
And the Great Pyramid is at the same degree. So is that another version of this same math that's kind of
That
broken down
51
into
at the
another
base,
angle?
but that 51 at the base produces the 76 at the top and vice versa. So it basically, in both cases, the angle was designed to allow precisely golden ratio implosion. And that implosion does this. The transverse comes in at one side on the left here and goes down the vortex called caduceus Hermes.
See, now I'm seeing an effect of like a Vogel crystal.
Well, see, the Vogel crystal piezo quartz is pure hex and will not dump out anything longitudinal until there's a golden ratio phase conjugate pump wave, which is your own bliss. So Marcel could not affect the plant on the polygraph until he actually made bliss in his own brainwaves.
That's why love works the best out of it. So to try to use a Vogel crystal to hate somebody doesn't work out.
Well,
okay.
but later we'll use that as a lesson to learn how piezo crystals like Koski Frost made 800 times their own weight, and that's the only real introduction to warp propulsion, which is later in the slideshow, that understanding. So but the point is that when the compression has the right geometry, then the transverse on the left becomes longitudinal on the right. And that's what a gravity wave is made of. I don't know, you probably know.
Much like a laser, much like light does in a laser.
Yeah. So at the squirt gun tip, which is called Planck, the transverse translation of vorticity spits out longitudinal. And this is Bearden's book of equations showing that longitudinal waves are what gravity waves are made of. So you're basically making gravity. It's a gravity diode. So this is the transverse wave versus the longitudinal. So longitudinal compression is in the direction of wave propagation. And that compression wave would go through about anything.
So a transverse wave is basically how most waves occur in nature.
Well, actually, the orderly, more disciplined longitudinal component is present, particularly on the Earth grid nodes, et cetera. But your physics, electrical engineering teacher only knows how to use the transverse component for communication because they're idiots. No, let me say.
Okay.
Nature uses the longitudinal component for communication. It's called DNA radio, but your local electrical engineer don't have a clue.
Which is why they don't subscribe to the science. So they don't subscribe to ESP, and all these things don't exist to them.
Which means until we can teach your university and government what a soul is, everyone on Earth is doomed to be the Borg. So let's hurry up and do it.
Wow.
Yeah, because you can't make intelligent decisions as a government till you know what the physics of soul is, and the physics of soul is precisely longitudinal coherence. So when the longitudinal waves implode compressively, that's when you get, for example, nuclear critical mass. And so the reason Schauberger got voltage from gravity, there was a voltage difference between the widest point and the narrowest point. And that's a pressure difference. And that vortex had to be piezoelectrically doped. And that's an introduction to the mercury vortex that you saw.
So that's exactly what I saw. Well, it was different. It was in a glass cylinder, but you know what else I saw was there was another version where it had smaller vortexes in a nearby it along the bottom.
Yeah.
Like other vortexes that were going around at the bottom of it.
And were they some of those vortex had a perpendicular axis?
You mean the same exact, the same?
No, some of the vortex went this way and some of them went this way, right? Attitude control?
You know, I just glanced at it for a short time and I was very impressed. Like I was being hurried through the door and they had the cover off the motor. And that's what I saw. And I just remember that the color that it was lit up. There was light throughout the liquid and it was a purple, I want to say bluish purple. But there were several vortexes. I remember that there was a large one arranged just like this, and there were several other vortexes around the bottom of it in a separate, I believe it was a separate tank, but I only glanced at it and I was impressed by it and kind of moved on, you know.
Yeah, so but it's wonderful that you remember. So what we conclude that, I mean, the classic description of Haunebu, Vimana, Nazi-Bell is two counter-rotating large cylinders, and in the gap between them, the liquid mercury was doped with an iron powder, which it was a special wetting agent, and then it became red, which might be the purple you saw, and that famous red mercury. And the iron powder made magnetic flux permissivity parallel to the specific gravity hydraulic flux density of the mercury. And in both cases, the hydraulic inertia and the magnetic inertia, when they would converge at the correct angle at the throat of that vortex, the inertia would be translated into a longitudinal wave emitting out the bottom directionally, which is producing gravity. The key is to understand that when you compress transverse at the correct compression angles, that implosion, translation of vorticity, will produce longitudinal EMF coherence directionally. And that is the beginning of making gravity, actually.
So something that's never really said about the UFO, the disk UFO phenomenon. It's very rarely, I've very rarely heard it, and it's very rare, but the disk doesn't fly like a Frisbee.
No.
It flies going, like the top of it is going forward. The disk flies in that direction.
Yeah.
That's what I remember.
Yes, and so the ability to steer has to do with minor changes in the orientation of that vortex, which has to be controlled exquisitely magnetically, I would assume. And it's just like trying to control your flight with just a squirt gun. And so the idea is, the basic physics here is that producing a longitudinal wave in one direction, directionally, is precisely what gravity is made of. And the reason is because that produces the experience of acceleration, and it's asymmetrical. It's going in one direction down the center of that vortex.
So the fastest craft they had, we called a double disk, and it was more of a figure eight. It was two of them.
Oh, yes.
That was much faster than the single one. But now I'm starting to look at the cylinder design and think maybe that's why they were way more maneuverable. So the cargo ship that I was on was extremely maneuverable. Like there was only a few instances where I could look out the window, and once I was on the bridge, and it maneuvered extremely well. Like not like you would think a squirt gun, but it probably had several of these outputs, like two or four squirt guns.
Well, and look here, you see the three at the bottom. You could triangulate. That's one possibility. But yes, the maneuverability. And remember, this is crude by comparison to the warp, the crystal propulsion, which is next in the series. But just the idea that once you understand the production of coherent longitudinal EMF directionally, then you don't have to be an idiot about these things and instead start thinking about the physics. And I wanted to make the point here that, I mean, that humans are so primitive that, because not knowing why an object falls to the ground really puts this planet last on the ladder of understanding any kind of science. It's extremely excruciatingly disgusting. You know, these physicists running around
Well,
thinking
it's on purpose.
You know, and that the fact that the myth of not knowing why objects fall to the ground propagates all of physics on this planet is absolutely nauseating. Excuse me, but I think Maurice Cotterell said it once.
Well,
they seem to be pretty arrogant for not having a clue why an object falls to the ground.
I think they figured it out in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then they closed the door behind them because they understood what an advantage it would give them.
Yeah, Bearden understood. Absolutely. I just want to point out that we actually have equations now, fractalfield.com/propulsion, for the angle of the wrap factor around the torus to optimize the amount of propulsion, and then more in the solid state direction. So once you understand phase conjugation, here is the famous EM drive, and you see in the background this brass-shaped trapezoidal cone, and the microwave is cascading in a caduceus. And now we know that if you retuned that to using my equation, Planck and Golden ratio, you could optimize the amount of gravity you're making, because the microwave is imploding, conjugating directionally. And at that implosion point, you make some longitudinal, and that's the reason the EM drive flies. It's really quite simple physics.
That may be another reason why we see the trapezoid in a lot of the structure, like the symbology of the secret space program throughout the cosmos, throughout the solar system built out, that we see the trapezoid built in. It may represent this
imploding trapezoid. Yes, very good. And this is just, when you spin the gyroscope and nutate precess at the right phase angle, you can radically speed up the gyroscope by phase locking the high-speed spin with the precession rate, and that phase lock will speed it up. So that's the reason you need things like pyramid gravity diodes to phase lock Earth spin to zodiacal spin. You stabilize that cascade, which stabilizes gravity and atmosphere. This was Hermes, basically, the Thoth, who was coming back and forth, I think. And they called this planet taming. And it's because there's a narrow tightrope between too much gravity and no life, and too little gravity and no atmosphere. To massage that tightrope, you use planet taming, which is this nutation precession phase lock, which is basically what one of the pyramid's major function. It would accelerate evolution.
So you're saying they could adjust the actual amount of gravity on the Earth?
Well, remember, the pyramids are a gravity diode. They're making longitudinal, and they're pumping around that longitudinal wave around the planet. That's a global wireless power, and it worked. They were at longitudinal nodes. But there was another function. It had to do restoring atmosphere at a time when, half the planets of the solar system just lost theirs. Hello, Mars included. They just screwed with the solar system bad. So they had work to do. And this was to stabilize, planetary. And this was called planet taming. This was called the Cedars. That's what their job was. This is, I think we had this conversation before, but this is just an image which Elena says is approximate of which craft is this? Do you remember this?
I'm not sure.
Excelsior, maybe? I'm not sure.
Maybe.
But in most cases, it's visualized with a giant crystal up the center. And we believe that this nodal array here that looks like carbon fullerene is actually a super dielectric delivering a phase conjugate pump wave, which is a gravity maker. And that's where we're getting to the concept of what is warp propulsion. And you can read the book at fractalfield.com/propulsion, thanks to Bill Donovan, now Elizabeth Donovan, Glimpses of Epiphany, crystal propulsion. So he wrote a book about this Koski-Frost device. This is the Koski-Frost device, made 800 times its own weight in gravity, and the phase conjugate pump wave looked like a caduceus, literally, the Schumann cascade. And so this is what you're doing, is you're pumping an implosive cascade that looks like a caduceus up the z-axis. This is the top straight c-axis shown here of a quartz crystal, and the phase conjugate pump wave, in Marcel's case, it was his own brain waves, so then the helix would begin to implode. It's naturally piezoelectric. Piezo just means that compression on the side axis converts to voltage on the perpendicular axis. And so when that cascade of harmonics of the phase conjugate caduceus pumps, that Koski-Frost crystal expanded dramatically and then made 800 times its own weight in gravity. And this is just an introduction.
Wait, in that last previous slide with the girl in the chair. So you're saying the box in the center is crystalline?
This was Science and Invention magazine, 1927, and that was a fantasy on the left, gravity conquered, but on the right is actual pictures of what was being done. You had an RF wave pumping into a crystal at the center. That's a quartz crystal cube in that case. And we think things like barium strontium titanate or lithium niobate, Scotty's dilithium crystals would be more efficient, and because they're more efficient piezoelectrically.
So this is we're looking at what they, I always use the terminology, what they claimed to be an anti-grav device in 1927.
That's right. Oh yeah, this was, and it's also documented that the U.S. government had a lot of trouble to remove that publication from every university library in the country. We're pretty sure. So
wonder why.
Well,
wait, and this one, I have a quick question about the lattice mark. So on the left, is that what the structure of a crystal looks like at the atomic
so this
level?
this is a model of silicon dioxide, SiO2, which nests tetracubically. And if you ratchet that tetracube up a helix, that's called quartz with a hex shadow.
So a quartz has these organized in a helix that goes from one end to, so
Right.
It does have a grain to it.
Yes,
and that's
absolutely.
what produces the correct cut and helps the Vogel effect.
Well, yeah, and what Marcel, I was with IBM at the time also, and I quizzed Marcel on this because we knew the Atlantean fire crystal physics at the time, and the way to align the facet plane with the molecular plane, Marcel really was not aware, but you have to use the birefringence of the z-axis, which rotates the plane of polarized light, in order to accurately model where the facet planes are to get them aligned with the molecular planes. And
you had to find the grain of the crystal.
You had to find the accurate z-axis, the vertical axis here, and you find it by that axis will most rotate the plane of polarity of polarized light. And it's called birefringent in the case of quartz because it splits it into two parallel planes of rotation. And using those two as interferent versus referent is how the famous Raymond Royal Rife developed the Rife microscope, in which he saw things smaller than the wavelength he was using to look. That birefringent. So this is the dilithium crystal story, and Scotty blow the die. And this is when Keshe.
This is carbon.
Well, you see, this is just to show that if you rotate a conjugator, there's
our sine waves for Beth.
Well,
if you put that slide back, so there's sine waves there. Okay.
So that if you the Buckminster fullerene looks like this model, right? It's carbon, and if you rotate that, Keshe's car floated, actually rotating a conjugator. So if you can make fullerene, if you can make carbon nanopure enough, everything else on this planet looks like the Stone Age's energy and propulsion, actually. And so this is an introduction to it's called rotating conjugators. And the metaphor in the warp propulsion Koski-Frost and how the crystal craft warp propulsion works is that it effectively becomes a rotating conjugator because the z-axis helix of that quartz, the slinky, is rotating. The helix is and then it's a conjugator if there's a phase conjugate pump wave present. Visualize the caduceus, which is golden ratio times Planck, and that's in the case of human bliss, is dumping that infrasound in to modulate the piezo crystal. In the Therify, we dump the infrasound of human bliss into plasma, and we do rejuvenation. It's called a phase conjugate pump wave, is the technical term. It's just a wave shape, a caduceus based on golden ratio times Planck.
Does so I'm just curious how many times you have to times the Planck times golden ratio before you get up to a measurable distance, like an inch or a centimeter, for instance. Like how many levels of golden ratio are you out from a Planck? It's got to be quite a bit.
Yeah, it's here's, I think the equation is here. So this is Planck times golden ratio in seconds in hertz. There's a similar table for inches. But just to give you an idea, the British foot, remember, this charge collapse defines the concept of sacred in general, as proven by the fact that the British foot, which is the basis of all other sacred lengths, actually, is exactly golden ratio to the 1/64th power times Planck, actually.
But not the meter, not on the metric, but in the imperial.
I was kind of best friends with John Michel, who dedicated his life to that problem to try to prove the meter is evil. Actually, what he simply proved was that charge collapse is enabled with golden ratio times Planck, which enables negentropy, which defines the sacred. So we know exactly what sacred dimension is, and now we're using that when we teach biologic architecture around the planet, using that, bioarchitects.net. So here are multiples of golden ratio times Planck from 3 exact radii of hydrogen, diene diphosphate, the photosynthesis.
So we're at 100 million times.
Yeah, right? Well, it's
versus to get
so
get the hydrogen size.
Yeah, so the golden ratio, the 240th power, is the Venus year and Earth year, actually, times Planck time, to give you an idea. So, but the point is that only nodes on that array, on that line, are negentropic. That's called Origin of Biologic Negentropy, the title of my book. And this is an example of a phase conjugate pump wave. In blue is the exact equations, and this is in Hertz. And in green are the actual harmonics of the Schumann cascade. You see the Schumann cascade, 3 Hertz, 7.8, 3, 14, and 20, approximates a phase conjugate pump wave, and that's why the pyramids could make global wireless power. They were called the Hummer for that reason.
So the reason I asked that question is I want kind of people to understand how incredibly small Planck is.
It's 1.61 times 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, actually.
Yeah, sounds big, but it's a lot. It's mind-bogglingly small. The other reason being is, like, for my own purposes, I consider the Planck a pixel. Like the way that we look at a screen, a TV screen, the pixels have a certain size to them. The pixel to our universe, to what you're looking at, the pixel is the size of a Planck, which is ridiculously small. You're looking at the most resolution screen that we can imagine.
Exactly right.
The Planck is so small, and these are pixels of the universe.
Well said.
The time and light are locked into these pixels, the distance of these pixels. And so the illusion is that
it's so well said. Well said. But the point being here is that since Planck is the same for thousands of light years in all directions, there's got to be a reason. And that reason ain't the Big Bang. No, that reason is because that's how gravity propagates. Hello.
Because that's the minimum that it would be.
The Planck is the threshold at which compression can impedance match the longitudinal array and therefore stabilize gravity, which is why the golden ratio is the dominant geometry of all orbital mechanics. I repeat, all orbital mechanics. Hello, is that a smoking gun for the cause of gravity?
I'm curious. Now I want to talk to an astrophysicist, because are they aware of that? Like on the orbital mechanics, are they using golden ratio in their studies of galaxies and such?
Spirosolaris.ca, a whole big website proving the dominant geometry of all orbital. They proved that the geometry of all masses in the universe is a dodecahedron, and then they proved that the universe is fractal. Then they proved that the geometry of the ether is golden ratio. Then they proved the Earth grid is dodecahedral, and the geometry of DNA, and then the geometry of hydrogen. It's all based on golden ratio for a reason.
From the spiral galaxy all the way down.
Up and down, wherever you go. It's called scale invariance. And Einstein had a clue. He said non-destructive compression is the solution of the unified field. He was right. He didn't know what a fractal was, and he certainly didn't know what a fractal field was. But once you do know what a fractal field is, then you know the cause of gravity, because you know the cause of non-destructive compression. And direct your scientist friend to planckfire.com, please.
Yes. My scientist friend, whatever, that's a different story. I want to bring something up. You mentioned Einstein. So did we call it a wormhole? Are you calling these portals? Did my ship go through an Einstein-Rosen bridge wormhole, or was it some other phenomenon that it was using to jump specifically? They had to spin up. They had to save a great deal of power, and they generated what I believe was an Einstein-Rosen bridge and jumped immediately to other star systems. So was that what you...
Yeah, I think the people who, conventional physicists say that entanglement connects you to an Einstein-Rosen bridge, which is not wrong. It's just stupidly inaccurate language. The correct language would be entanglement perfected is the definition of phase conjugation. Hello, which is what produces entanglement. And what they're calling an Einstein-Rosen bridge is because they don't have a clue what an array is, because Einstein's sitting there like a dummy saying action at a distance is spooky, because he didn't know what a longitudinal wave was. He didn't know when an object falls to the ground.
So
he
they
didn't know
could
what non-destructive compression was.
use the golden ratio to predict what the what the fabric of space-time was doing at the other end, and then tune into that same thing and create the hole on both sides and go. That's what's going
Connection
on.
to the array, which is a connection to
Through the array. That's right.
Yeah, it's a connection to the enabled compression points. That's the key language here, because the longitudinal node is enabled compression, where compression is non-destructive. That's why there's such a dramatic difference in nuclear critical mass at the magnetic
So
line.
they're causing a compression point on one end and an identical one at the
yes, and it has to be absolutely frequency matched send to receive point to work. It's actually the same way IP works. The packets bounce all around, but they got to find the one with the address that matches. It's actually remarkably parallel to IP.
And it's what Jean-Charles has done organically. They're using some sort of technology.
Oh, of course. And I even discussed that with Elena. At first, Jean-Charles mostly went to beaches. You know why? Longitudinal interferometry is more coherent there. And then he went to the stasis chambers, the storage vault, the key sites, and that's also longitudinal nodes, the stasis chambers. So you need a longitudinal node for send and receive accuracy.
So what I remember was that the power output of the ship determined how far it could go. Well, so they couldn't just jump anywhere in creation. They were limited also in time. So the same exact technology gave them the ability to go a certain amount back in time or forward in time, or a distance. Like they could only, let's call it a light year. Let's call it 6 months in the future, 6 months in the past, or a light year in distance, and they could coordinate and go. That was the limitation of the power output of the ship, and that the military ships could go much farther and instantly back. They had several of the same exact motor. They would have more than one of the same motor on the ship, so that they could immediately jump into an area and jump away. It was a valuable thing. Our ship was a cargo ship. We had to wait 30 minutes or so. It was less. It was 15 to 20 minutes for the ship to recharge enough power to jump again.
Yeah, and there would be an implosive moment. The theory would be that the number of harmonics in the cascade that you could line up, literally harmonic inclusiveness, would predict how far you could go, because it would predict how many multiples of the speed of light times c, of golden ratio times c, the speed of light, you could nest coherently. So it's literally how big was the pine cones that were kissing noses.
So that was determined. So they had a power out. So they had a machine that was doing that, and it was determined by their power output.
It's very much like Therify.net. We have an RF component, we have optical phase conjugation with the noble gases, and then we have an infrasound cascade, which is accurate phase conjugate pump wave. And if that was broader spectral, we can already trigger lucid dreaming, so we just amp it up a little bit. That's what a Stargate is.
One more thing on the lucid dreaming is that I remembered early on that when I was on my missions in Peru, when they were using me for channeling information for lucid dreaming. Let's call it just lucid dreaming. The first time it didn't work because I was on an airplane. They said the EMF field from the instruments may have
there
interfered.
You go.
Then they sent down a silver mesh blanket to block the EM fields, and it worked. So fast forward to now, I went to San Jose and talked to some scientists, and I asked them about this Faraday fabric. I found a good source of it, and I bought a blanket of it, and I immediately, and everybody I talked to, I can't say everybody, but most of the people that I've referred it to, sleep under these blankets and immediately just dream, excuse my language, dream your ass off. Just amazingly, the quality of sleep and dreaming is greatly improved just by sleeping under this blanket. And so much so, days I don't sleep with it, I feel not good when I wake up.
Well, I do have an experiment to suggest to you. Actually, the theory of optimal lucid dreaming portal Stargate is not actually isolation. The theory of optimized is embedding. Now, that is the opposite of your blanket. Here's the way you could prove what I just said. Find a cabin in a magical woods somewhere and try your lucid dreaming there. It should be 100 times better than your blanket, and you don't need the damn blanket.
Look, I dare I say this publicly, but this is the money make to find some way to map these areas. these
Well,
magnetic ley lines to find out where they're at.
well,
Like
that's
you said, the
actually
ancient.
well known. There, even many governments publish magnetic maps, but to actually find the nodal cross points. It's Advanced Geobiology Introduction, goldenmean.info/geobiology. But basic dowsing skill is survival required for everyone. Because if you can't feel an Earth magnetic line, you can't feel by definition. Actually, it just happens that the more bliss you have, the better you can feel.
Well, what I'm saying is that this greatly changes the value of real estate,
Thank you, thank
is
you,
this
and
greatly changes the value of where you
and
are.
every ancient cathedral, every ancient labyrinth, every one of those guys, every ancient stone tower, they all knew. Your real estate agent doesn't, but that means they're an idiot. I'm sorry, I'm not being subtle here, but
Yeah, it's okay.
sacred space is enabled communication to the array. It's even better than fiber.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
there's again, there's homework to do after that. So
Yeah. But so do you see that maybe we could eventually make some suggestions for trials like Therify.net? There's active groups doing, we have luciddreamteam.com. They're active groups doing, they'd love to be in touch with your group, I think. But
I think so too.
the people that are doing remote healing successfully now know this is not a mystery. They get on a magnetic line cross point, send and receive point. They do it at sunrise and sunset. They use a psychotronic witness, a high-res photographs and things like that. So they're actually coupling the nodes intelligently. Because
You have to, if you're going to synchronize, it's better to be in the same area where there's a mutual sunset. So we kind of aim.
yeah, but a sunset at either end can be helpful, but there's other things that can enable compression, particularly magnetic line cross points, et cetera. And obviously, for the same reason that negative ion wind therapy doesn't work, if the room is full of metal and synthetics, Therify plasma is the same, and lucid dreaming is the same. So if you get a room with all natural everything, it's called dielectric constant. It's the definition of biologic architecture, enables capacitive implosion, which enables seed germination. That's how we determine which architects deserve a paycheck, those who can make a seed grow. And that's measurable.
I'm aware that the blanket isn't of the a one. All it's doing is blocking out a lot of the EMF that is polluting,
Right.
mucking it up. So it's just reducing that. I'm aware because I'm not wrapping up completely in a cage version of it. It's just reducing the pollution, I think. And
and if you were in
nature,
sleep
quality is noticeable.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that in the long term, ensoulment requires the opposite of the Faraday blanket. Ensoulment requires going to where Luke Skywalker did to raise the dead,
Connect.
Deep in nature. And
Camping.
that's where you can see orbs and plasma. It's living plasma. And that's enabled by charge distribution efficiency, the definition of heaven.
Well, and you know what? If you research, well, people come to me. So since I've gone public, people come to me and say, Tony, I'm having all these strange things happen to me. It kind of sounds like what you went through. Let's talk about it. And what I found is that when you get the positive experiences, they tend to be localized in certain areas. People in Australia have a much different experience with contact, be it mentally or physically being taken, than people in America. And people in certain parts of America have a much different, they tend to have, so what I'm saying is the positive interaction with ETs or whatever you want to call it, whatever it is, with the positive interaction with the weirdness tends to be localized, and the negative interactions tend to be scattered, which means it's a military that takes and picks and chooses wherever they want, and the positive ones are in tune to people that are in one of these areas that possibly could be in one of these areas. So that would fall in line with what I've realized as well. So I don't tell people like, hey, so where do you live? First question, where do you live? And then they tell me where they live. And the first thing I know is what's coming next is that they had a very hard time in their interactions, or they had a not so bad time in their interactions.
Yes.
So they tend to be localized.
And the Aboriginals called these song lines, and eventually the plasma lines became the family pet, and they could talk to them. And this reminds us also of Phil Callahan when he measured paramagnetic diamagnetic, that if you measure the Earth's ability to conduct magnetism, you can predict in advance not just which village is going to be headhunters versus friendly, which he did practically in the Amazon, but he could also predict in advance where war versus peace would break out. PeaceUniversity.net. That's the start of the curriculum.
Interesting.
So village A makes war on village B when somebody cuts the magnetic line, man.
Wow. Oh,
And that's
wow.
proven. It's actually been tested. Peaceuniversity.net, you can read the curriculum. So peace is literally defined by the negentropy of charge distribution efficiency. And where you start is, does the soil conduct magnetism, basically?
Interesting. So it feels like homework to do. It feels like I said, I'm really interested in the real estate versions of it. I'd like to discover the areas that are
Yeah.
high in this and just kind of study the history around that area. I think that would be telling. I think when you compared it with other areas
Yeah.
that
And
have
yeah, and we taught physics of feng
less
shui
access to,
for
you
many
know,
years.
the array.
Yeah, yeah. And actually our friend Jan in London was Princess Diana's feng shui teacher, actually. So feng shui is an ancient knowledge of the living nature of that grid, actually. But when you convert it to physics, for example, in feng shui, a right angle is called evil. It's actually destructive to capacitive implosion. And the perfect feng shui is actually the shape of the feminine body because it's actually perfected charge distribution. So it's all about living plasma, actually, and that's value. That is real estate value. Anyway,
Very interesting. So, as usual, like I said, talking to you is taking a sip from a fire hose. It comes fast and it comes complex. But I understood. I would think I was able to digest a lot of what you talked about today. And I'm glad that stuff that I'm saying also makes perfect sense to you, too.
it does.
That's a big step for me.
And the fact that you were a witness is valuable. I mean, you've been there. That's
I did
valuable.
not want to take it to the grave. When I originally got the memories back, I thought there's no way I can take all this to the grave with me. Number one, it'll drive me crazy to not speak to somebody about it. Number two, I can't see the last few minutes of my life wishing I had told everybody about everything that I remembered because it all came so quickly and there was so much of it. So I didn't know what was going to happen back then, but I knew I had to tell people about it.
And the physics of immortality, we call it the shareablewave.com. And you're becoming a shareable wave. It's all good.
Yes, I do want to say this. Since I love the way that you plug all your sites as you go. I want to plug mine, TonyRodriguez.com. And through my Patreon is where the remote view group is. There's a subscription there, and it's remote viewing for dummies. So we're starting, and I'm not calling anybody dummies, but I'm saying we start at the beginning, somebody that knows nothing about it, and we go through the group. We're going through various techniques, not only the public stuff through the far side, but other techniques reported. And the group meets on Zoom and we go over it, and then we have targets. So you can't remote view without a blind target correctly. So you can't just say, I want to remote view and see what my ex-wife is doing with that girl, and then go in and get an accurate thing. It has to be a blind target. It must be blind. And the real benefit of joining a remote view group is the blind targeting, so that you just get a set of numbers and you do your remote view, and that flushes out the most accuracy. So that's what we do. I want to plug that out there. I'm trying to grow that group because it's just shocking the great results that we get. So so far we're doing things like parks and places, like rooms. I did this room and it was freaky. I'll never do my own office or anywhere I live again because people are so accurate. It felt creepy. I felt like I was being spied upon because people were accurately describing things in my office. And so that's not going to happen again. But the remote viewing is a real thing. I think anybody can do it. It just takes learning the protocol, and it flexes, or it trains your intuition, which we all should be using every day anyway. Remote viewing, it's not about spying. It's about listening to the correct voice of intuition in your mind. Is it clutter or confetti, as the far side calls it? Is it mental confetti, or is it your actual correct intuition? And the remote viewing group lets you identify which one that is and get more in touch. And if we all followed our intuition, the world would be a much better place, I think.
Well said, Tony. It's super. And in the 9 Faces of Christ, they show the first day when you remote view or lucid dream, you could see your lover, but you couldn't smell her. But the second day you went, you had more longitudinal coherence. And on that day, you took more organs of perception with you. So there's a lot to be said about developing that emotional coherence. Like after Kundalini, I cried for a month. So you sort your emotions and then you can propagate more coherently. And there's all
That's
kinds
right. And if when you think about it in terms like that, so this brings up another point. You think about it in terms like that, you're seeing why there's an artificial fear being instilled through all the media, through the powers that be, because they know that shuts that down for the average man.
Yeah,
if you're always in a state of worry, you're worrying about like this is going to happen, the economy's going to fail, the end of the sky is falling. this and that. When you put on entertainment and you see gore and violence, your mind is always far away from your intuitive self, which is really what you need, what we all need. And
That's
so
right.
that's an
Yes.
important point.
So, which is, I mean, literally fearlessness. Fear is the mind killer. So we need to understand how our inner bliss responds to peace and not fear. Thank
It
you.
was a major turning point to actually consciously say, I'm not going to be afraid of my shadow. I'm not going to be afraid of everything. And I just wanted to try that on and see what would happen if I wasn't, because I realized I was making most of my daily decisions based on fear.
Yeah.
And, you know, in a
Thank
panic.
you,
And when
Tony.
I consciously let go of that, my life changed completely, and I can do nothing but recommend it for everybody. You know, there's a certain amount of fear that makes sense. Like, obviously, I'm not going to walk on a ledge and make my YouTube of me jumping over to high altitudes because I'm afraid of falling, for one. But I'm saying, like, day-to-day decisions and nurturing fear is the wrong thing to do across the board.
So you're literally following your own bliss. Tony, you're a great example here. I'm really delighted to work with you. Well said. Thank you.
I think we got more to do. But we should probably wrap up because this is a lot to ingest, and I can't wait to watch this over.
Thank you, Tony. It's been a blessing. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being a shareable wave and having so much integrity when you shared your memory, Tony. Really, I congratulate you.
I didn't know what to expect. So far, and like I said, that was the moment I said, I'm going to talk about this, and I'm not going to be afraid of what happens, because I did put myself out there for a lot of abuse, and it panned out. So I just think it's more important than me getting the abuse. So
a real walking hero. Thank you, Tony. Bless
I wouldn't take that, but that was my motivation, is what I'm saying.
He's following his bliss, folks. Thank you. Talk again soon, Tony. I love doing this.
You betcha, Dan. Thank you.
Terrible. Blessings. Bye-bye.